Captain Dahlia Cross had seen her fair share of cosmic disasters, diplomatic nightmares, and interspecies incidents that would make a seasoned politician weep into their morning coffee. But this was something entirely different. Something that made her stomach twist in ways that had nothing to do with the artificial gravity fluctuations aboard the Harmony's Edge. The distress signal had arrived at 0300 hours, ship time. Because, of course it did. The universe, it seemed, had a particular fondness for ruining perfectly good sleep cycles with crisis communications that started with the words urgent and immediate response required. "Captain," her communications officer had said, voice tight with that particular brand of tension that meant someone, somewhere, was having a very bad day. "We're receiving a priority alpha transmission from the Thylorian homeworld." Dahlia had rolled out of her bunk, pulled on her uniform, and made her way to the bridge with the resigned efficiency of someone who'd done this dance too many times before. The Thylorians weren't exactly known for their casual Friday calls. When they reached out to human vessels, it usually meant something had gone spectacularly wrong. What she hadn't expected was to find Ambassador Gorvak's massive, wolf-like form filling her main view screen, his silver-gray fur bristling with barely contained aggression, and his golden eyes burning with the kind of fury that made smart people take several steps backward. "Human vessel," Gorvak's voice rumbled through the bridge speakers like distant thunder, each word carefully enunciated with the precision of someone fighting to maintain diplomatic protocol, while every instinct screamed at him to bare his fangs. "You will alter course immediately. The Thylorian Council of Alphas has declared our space off-limits to all foreign vessels." Dahlia had blinked at that. The Thylorians were proud. Sure. Stubborn as a mule with a philosophy degree, absolutely. But they weren't isolationists. Their trade agreements with humanity had been running smoothly for nearly 2 decades. Something was very, very wrong. "Ambassador Gorvak," she'd replied, settling into her captain's chair with the kind of calm that came from dealing with panicked aliens on a semi-regular basis. "We received your distress signal. Our medical and humanitarian teams are standing by to assist with whatever crisis you're facing." The sound that came from Gorvak's throat was somewhere between a growl and a laugh, but it held no humor whatsoever. "Your kind meddles where you don't belong, human. This is pack business, sacred business. Your interference would be an insult to our ancestors and a violation of laws older than your species' ability to speak." Oh, how delightfully dramatic. Dahlia had to resist the urge to roll her eyes. The Thylorians had a flair for the theatrical that would make Shakespearean actors weep with envy. But underneath all that posturing, she could hear something else in Gorvak's voice, something that made her lean forward in her chair and pay attention. Fear. "Ambassador," she'd said, keeping her tone carefully neutral, "we're not here to interfere with your customs or laws. We're here because you sent out a distress signal, a medical emergency signal specifically. If your people are in danger..." "Our people are not your concern," Gorvak had snapped, his composure cracking just enough for Dahlia to catch a glimpse of something raw and desperate underneath. "The cubs, the situation. It will be handled according to our ways. Human medicine, human interference, human arrogance. None of it is welcome here." Cubs. The word hit Dahlia like a physical blow. Whatever was happening down there, it was affecting the children. The Thylorian young, those precious few who represented the future of their entire species. "How many?" she'd asked quietly. Gorvak's ears had flattened against his skull. "That is not your concern, human. How many cubs are sick, Ambassador?" For a long moment, the bridge had been silent except for the gentle hum of life support systems and the distant whisper of the ship's engines. Gorvak's golden eyes had stared at her through the view screen, and she could see the war being fought behind them. Pride versus desperation. Tradition versus necessity. 43 facilities, he'd finally said, his voice barely above a whisper. "Thousands of cubs. The plague. It spreads fast. Our healers are working without sleep, but the traditional remedies. He'd stopped himself, straightening with visible effort. But that changes nothing. You will leave our space immediately or face the consequences. The transmission had cut out, leaving Dahlia staring at a blank screen and feeling like she'd just been punched in the gut. Thousands of cubs. Children, essentially. Dying from some kind of plague while their parents watched helplessly, too proud to accept help from outsiders. "Captain," her first officer had ventured. "Orders?" Dahlia had stood up, her mind already racing through possibilities, protocols, and the various ways this could go catastrophically wrong. "Pull up everything we have on Thylorian biology and medicine. I want to know what kind of diseases affect their young, what treatments exist, and what might cause a pandemic like this." "Captain," her medical officer had interjected, "the Prime Directive clearly states that we cannot interfere with internal affairs of other species without explicit consent." The ambassador was quite clear. "The ambassador," Dahlia had cut her off, "is watching his species' children die while clinging to pride and tradition. And yes, I'm aware of the Prime Directive. I'm also aware that it has exceptions for humanitarian crises." She'd paced to the viewport, staring out at the swirling blue-green marble that was the Thylorian homeworld. Beautiful from a distance, peaceful even. But down there, in medical facilities across the planet, children were suffering while politics and pride got in the way of basic compassion. "Ma'am," her communications officer had called out, "we're receiving another transmission. Not from the government this time. It's coming from one of their medical facilities." The screen had flickered to life again, but this time it showed a much younger Thylorian, his brown fur matted with exhaustion and his eyes red-rimmed from sleeplessness. Behind him, Dahlia could make out what looked like a medical ward filled with small forms lying still under thermal blankets. "Human vessel," the young Thylorian had said, glancing nervously over his shoulder. "I am Torix, junior medic at the Central Healing Complex. I know the Council has forbidden contact, but I had to try. We're losing them. 3, sometimes 4 cubs per facility every day. Our medicines aren't working, and the elders refuse to consider that maybe, just maybe, there might be other options." Dahlia had felt something cold settle in her stomach. "What are the symptoms, Torix?" "High fever, respiratory distress, internal bleeding. It starts with a simple cough and progresses rapidly. We've tried everything. Traditional herb treatments, energy healing, even some of the more experimental approaches. Nothing is working." His voice had cracked slightly. "My own cub. She's in the 3rd stage now. The healers say—" He hadn't needed to finish. Dahlia could see it in his eyes. "Torix," she'd said carefully, "I need you to send us everything you have on this plague. Medical data, progression charts, anything that might help our doctors understand what you're dealing with." "I can't. The Council would have me exiled if they knew I was even talking to you, but—" He'd hesitated, then looked directly into the camera. "If you could help them, would you? Even knowing it might cause a diplomatic incident?" It was the kind of question that career officers were trained to deflect, to refer up the chain of command, to bury in committees and protocols until someone else had to make the hard choices. But looking at this young father's desperate face, with dozens of dying children in the background, Dahlia had found herself answering without hesitation. "Yes." Torix had nodded once, quickly, then cut the transmission. The bridge had fallen silent again, but this time it was the kind of silence that came before storms. Dahlia could feel her crew watching her, waiting to see what she would do next. The safe thing. The protocol thing. The thing that wouldn't end her career and land her in front of a court-martial. Instead, she'd turn to her science officer. "I want a full analysis of any data Torix sends us, and pull up our medical databases, anything we have on plagues, respiratory diseases, anything that might match these symptoms." "Captain," her first officer had said quietly, "if we get involved in this without proper authorization—" "Then we get involved," Dahlia had replied. Those are children down. There, Commander. Dying children. And if there's even a chance we can help them, then we damn well better try. What she hadn't said, couldn't say not yet, was that she was already forming a plan. A supremely stupid, career-ending, definitely going to get her court-martialed plan that involved breaking about 16 different regulations and probably violating several interstellar treaties. But as the data started coming in from Torix, as her medical team began analyzing the symptoms and progression of the plague, Dahlia felt a familiar burning in her chest. The same feeling she'd had as a young officer when she'd first read the Starfleet Charter, when she'd sworn an oath to protect and serve all sentient life. The Thylorians could keep their pride. They could have their traditions and their ancient laws and their stubborn refusal to accept help. But they weren't going to watch their children die. Not if Dahlia Cross had anything to say about it. The universe, it seemed, was about to get a lesson in what happened when you put a human mother's protective instincts up against alien politics. And the universe, quite frankly, was not prepared for what was coming. The data that Torix had smuggled to them was, in Dahlia's professional opinion, both a blessing and a curse. A blessing because it gave her medical team something concrete to work with. A curse because it confirmed her worst fears about just how bad things had gotten on the Thylorian homeworld. "Captain," her chief medical officer had said, looking up from her analysis station with the kind of expression that meant someone was about to deliver very bad news. "I finished the preliminary analysis of the plague data." Dahlia had been pacing the medical bay for the better part of 3 hours, wearing a groove in the deck plating while her team worked. Sleep was a luxury she couldn't afford, not when children were dying with every passing hour. "What's the verdict, Doc?" "The good news is that we've seen this before. The bad news is that we've seen this before." The doctor had pulled up a holographic display showing molecular structures that looked like tiny, malevolent snowflakes. "This is a mutated strain of Cytherian hemorrhagic fever. We encountered it about 20 years ago on the mining colony at Beta Centauri." Dahlia had stopped pacing. "Cytherian fever? But that's completely treatable with modern human antibiotics, yes. The colonists on Beta Centauri lost maybe a dozen people before we figured out the right treatment protocol. But this strain..." The doctor had manipulated the hologram, highlighting specific molecular chains. "It's evolved, adapted specifically to Thylorian physiology. Their immune systems are fighting it, but they're fighting the wrong battle." The irony was so thick you could have served it for dinner. Here was humanity, barely 2 centuries into space travel, with a simple cure for a plague that was devastating one of the galaxy's most advanced civilizations. All because the Thylorians' pride wouldn't let them admit that maybe, just maybe, another species might have something useful to offer. "How long would it take to synthesize the treatment?" Dahlia had asked. "For the cubs. Maybe 6 hours to modify our existing antibiotics for Thylorian biochemistry. Another 2 hours to produce enough doses for..." The doctor had paused, consulting her data pad. "For the current infected population, 8 hours. 8 hours to save thousands of children, if she was willing to throw her career, her ship, and possibly her freedom into the garbage disposal of interstellar politics." It wasn't even a choice, really. "Do it," she'd said. Her first officer had looked like he was about to object, probably with some perfectly reasonable comment about regulations and proper authorization, and the dozen different ways this could end with all of them in military prison. But something in Dahlia's expression must have warned him off, because he'd simply nodded and said, "Yes, ma'am." The next few hours had been a masterclass in controlled chaos. Her medical team had worked with the kind of focused intensity usually reserved for wartime emergencies, synthesizing and testing and resynthesizing until they had vials of pale blue liquid that represented hope in its most concentrated form. Meanwhile, Dahlia had been planning something that would either go down in history as the most successful unauthorized humanitarian mission ever attempted, or as the stupidest career-ending stunt since that infamous incident with the Andorian ambassador and the ice sculpture. "Ma'am," her tactical officer had said, pulling up schematics on the main display. "I've located the medical facility where Torix is working. The central healing complex is here, in the capital city. Heavy atmospheric interference from their industrial sector, but nothing our sensors can't penetrate. Security? Dahlia had asked. Minimal. The Thylorians aren't expecting an invasion, they're expecting us to follow orders and stay away. Most of their defensive systems are focused on orbital approaches, not single-person infiltration. Single-person infiltration. The words had hung in the air like a challenge. Because that's what this was going to come down to, wasn't it? Someone was going to have to get down to that planet, get into that medical facility, and start treating cubs without anyone noticing until it was too late to stop them. And since it was her idea, her responsibility, and her conscience that wouldn't let her sleep while children died, that someone was obviously going to be her. "Captain," her first officer had said, because apparently he could read her mind and didn't like what he was seeing there. "You can't be seriously considering." "Oh, but I am." Dahlia had turned to her chief engineer. "How quickly can you modify a maintenance pod for atmospheric entry?" "Ma'am, those pods aren't designed for planetary insertion, the heat shielding alone." "How quickly?" The engineer had sighed with the resignation of someone who'd served under Dahlia long enough to know when arguing was pointless. 3 hours, if we strip out the non-essential systems and beef up the thermal protection. But Captain, even if you make it to the surface, you'll be on your own. We can't maintain communications through their atmospheric interference, and we certainly can't extract you if things go wrong. Perfect. A one-way ticket to certain court-martial with a strong possibility of interspecies incident on the side. Just the way Dahlia liked her humanitarian missions. The modified maintenance pod had been about as comfortable as sleeping in a metal coffin with trust issues. The atmospheric entry had been rougher than a diplomatic dinner with the Vulcans, and the landing had been, well, calling it a landing was being generous. Controlled crash was more accurate. But Dahlia had made it to the surface in one piece, clutching a medical bag full of synthesized antibiotics and a comm device that might work for about 5 minutes before the atmospheric interference turned it into an expensive paperweight. The Thylorian capital city at night was something out of a fever dream. Towering spires of crystalline architecture reached toward the stars, while bioluminescent gardens cast everything in an otherworldly blue-green glow. Under normal circumstances, Dahlia might have taken a moment to appreciate the alien beauty of it all. These weren't normal circumstances. The central healing complex was a massive structure that seemed to grow out of the ground like some kind of organic crystal formation. Getting inside had been easier than she'd expected. The Thylorians weren't security-focused when it came to their medical facilities. Why would they be? Who would be crazy enough to break into a hospital? Apparently, human starship captains with a pathological inability to follow orders when children's lives were at stake. The isolation ward had been heartbreaking, didn't begin to cover it. Dozens of small forms lay motionless under thermal regulation blankets, their breathing shallow and labored. Some were so still that Dahlia had to check twice to make sure they were still alive. Others were delirious with fever, making small whimpering sounds that cut straight through her heart and lodged there like shrapnel. She'd been 3 cubs into her unauthorized medical intervention when she'd heard footsteps behind her. "I thought I smelled something strange," a familiar voice had said. Dahlia had turned to find Torix standing in the doorway, but this wasn't the desperate father from the transmission. This was a Thylorian medic in his own territory, ears pinned back and hackles raised, looking like he was trying to decide whether to call security or handle the intruder himself. "Torix," she'd said, slowly rising from where she'd been kneeling beside a particularly small cub who couldn't have been more than 5 years old in human terms. "I know how this looks. It looks like a human has broken into our most secure medical facility and is experimenting on our dying children," he'd growled. But there was something in his voice that wasn't quite convincing. "It looks like you violated every treaty and law that exists between our species. It looks like I'm trying to save lives." Dahlia had held up the medical injector, its blue contents glowing softly in the dim light. "This is a modified antibiotic that targets the specific strain of fever that's killing these cubs. We've already tested it. It works, Torix. It works, and these children don't have to die. For a long moment, they'd stared at each other across the medical ward. A human woman who'd thrown away everything to save children that weren't even her species, and a Thylorian father watching his world crumble, one small life at a time. "My daughter," Torix had said finally, his voice cracking. "She's in the next ward, stage 4 progression. The healers say she has maybe hours left. Take me to her." What followed had been the longest walk of Dahlia's life. Through corridors filled with the quiet sounds of suffering, past rooms where Thylorian parents kept vigil beside beds that were far too small, toward a ward where the most critical cases were isolated from the rest. Torix's daughter had been a tiny thing, her golden fur matted with fever sweat, and her breathing so shallow it was barely visible. She looked nothing like her father, must have taken after her mother. But the resemblance was there in the stubborn set of her jaw, even in unconsciousness. "What's her name?" Dahlia had asked, preparing the injection. "Phyra," Torix had whispered. "It means bright star in the old tongue." Dahlia had administered the antibiotic with the kind of careful precision that came from years of emergency medicine training. Then she'd sat back and waited, watching for any sign of improvement or adverse reaction. "How long?" Torix had asked. "For humans, we usually see improvement within the first hour. For Thylorian physiology ... She'd shrugged. "I honestly don't know. This is all theoretical until we see results." They'd waited in silence. Two parents from different worlds, united by the universal fear of losing a child. Dahlia had found herself thinking about her own childhood, about the mother who'd raised her to believe that doing the right thing was more important than doing the safe thing. That mother would have been proud of her tonight. Terrified, but proud. 23 minutes later, Phyra's breathing had deepened. 31 minutes after that, her fever had broken. At the 1-hour mark, she'd opened her eyes and looked directly at Dahlia with a kind of clear, intelligent gaze that meant the inflammation in her brain was already receding. Torix had made a sound somewhere between a sob and a howl of relief. "More," he'd said, grabbing Dahlia's arm with enough force to leave bruises. "How many more doses do you have?" "Enough for every cub in this facility, with some to spare." Dahlia had stood up, shouldering her medical bag. "But we need to move fast. I don't know how long before someone notices what we're doing." What followed had been 2 hours of the most rewarding work Dahlia had ever done. Moving from bed to bed, ward to ward, injecting hope into small, still forms, and watching life return to eyes that had been dimmed by illness. Some cubs improved faster than others, but every single one responded to the treatment. And that's when things had gotten complicated. Because apparently, there was something about human biochemistry that the medical databases hadn't mentioned. Something about the way human pheromones interacted with young Thylorian neurochemistry. Something that became obvious when the first few cubs who'd recovered enough to be aware of their surroundings all turned to look at Dahlia with expressions of absolute, unwavering devotion. "That's unusual," Torix had said, watching his own daughter attempt to crawl out of her medical bed to get closer to the human who'd saved her life. Unusual didn't begin to cover it. By the time they'd finished treating the last cub in the facility, Dahlia had acquired what could only be described as a pack. 34 cubs, ranging in age from barely walking to nearly adolescent, all of whom seemed to have decided that she was the most important thing in their universe. "Torix," Dahlia had said, gently disentangling herself from a particularly clingy 5-year-old who decided her leg made an excellent hugging post. "Is this normal behavior for recovering cubs? For cubs who've been treated by their birth parents or pack medics? Yes. For cubs who've been treated by an alien species." Torix had looked around the ward, where dozens of small, fuzzy faces were all turned toward Dahlia with expressions of pure adoration. "I have absolutely no idea." That's when the alarms had started going off. "Security alert," the facility's automated system had announced in perfectly modulated Thylorian. Unauthorized personnel detected in Medical Wing C. All staff report to stations immediately. Dahlia had looked at Torix. Torix had looked at Dahlia. The cubs had looked at both of them with the kind of confusion that came from being too young to understand why the grown-ups were suddenly panicking, but old enough to know that panic was generally a bad thing. "Well," Dahlia had said, as the sound of running footsteps echoed down the corridor toward them, "this should be interesting." She'd had no idea just how interesting things were about to get. The Thylorian security team that burst into the medical ward looked like they'd been expecting to find a dangerous infiltrator, possibly armed, definitely hostile. What they found instead was a human woman sitting cross-legged on the floor, completely surrounded by a protective circle of cubs who'd positioned themselves between her and any potential threat with the kind of instinctive pack behavior that was older than Thylorian civilization itself. The lead security officer, a massive gray-furred male whose name tag read Commander Thaxis, had stopped so abruptly that his two subordinates nearly crashed into him from behind. His golden eyes had gone wide as he took in the scene. Dozens of cubs who'd been near death just hours ago, now alert and healthy and forming what could only be described as a defensive perimeter around the human who'd saved their lives. "What in the name of the Great Pack?" Thaxis had muttered, his weapon lowering almost involuntarily. "Commander," Torix had stepped forward, his voice carefully neutral. "These cubs were dying. All of them. This human brought medicine that saved their lives." "That human," Thaxis had replied, though his tone lacked the conviction it probably should have had, "is an unauthorized intruder who has violated our sovereignty and contaminated our children with alien substances." One of the cubs, a particularly bold little female with silver-tipped ears, had chosen that moment to growl at the security team. Not a cute, playful growl. A genuine, hackles-raised, "don't you dare threaten my pack mother" growl that would have been impressive coming from an adult Thylorian. It was absolutely terrifying coming from someone who probably still needed help tying her shoes. "Fyra, no," Torix had said quickly, recognizing his own daughter among the protective circle. "These are security officers. They're not going to hurt anyone." Fyra had looked at her biological father with the kind of patient expression that suggested she thought he was being adorably naive, then turned back to glaring at the security team with unwavering intensity. "Sir," one of the subordinate officers had whispered to Thaxis, "the cubs appear to have bonded with the intruder." "I can see that," Thaxis had replied through gritted teeth. "The question is what we do about it." That's when Ambassador Gorvac had arrived, flanked by 3 members of the Alpha Council and wearing an expression that could have frozen plasma at 1,000 meters. His silver fur was bristling with such fury that he looked like he'd been struck by lightning, and his golden eyes held the kind of rage that started wars and ended political careers. "Where," he'd said, his voice dropping to a register that made the walls vibrate, "is the human infiltrator?" 34 cubs had immediately moved closer to Dahlia, some of them actually climbing into her lap while others pressed against her sides and back. The message was unmistakable. "You want her. You go through us." Gorvac's expression had shifted from fury to something much more complex as he took in the scene. The healthy cubs who should have been dying. The protective formation that spoke to instincts buried deep in Thylorian DNA. The human woman at the center of it all, looking remarkably calm for someone who was about to become the center of an interstellar incident. "Impossible," one of the Alpha Council members had breathed. "The cubs have chosen her as pack leader." "Cubs can't choose an alien as pack leader," another had protested. "It's biologically impossible, culturally impossible." "Tell that to them," Dahlia had said quietly, gently stroking the fur of a small male who decided her shoulder made an excellent perch. "Because I don't think they got the memo about what's supposed to be impossible." Gorvac had stepped closer, moving with the careful, controlled grace of a predator who wasn't sure whether he was hunting or being hunted. "Human, you have violated our sovereignty, our laws, and our most sacred customs. You have interfered in matters that were not your concern. I saved their lives." Dahlia had replied, meeting his gaze without flinching. Your customs and laws were going to let these children die, rather than accept help from outsiders. So yes, I interfered. And I'd do it again. You have no idea what you've done, Gorvak had snarled. Pack bonds are sacred among our people. When cubs choose a leader, that choice cannot be undone. It's written into our genetic code, our social structure, our very identity as a species. So what you're saying is... Dahlia had paused as another cub decided her other shoulder needed occupying. I'm legally their pack mother now? The silence that followed was the kind of silence that historians would probably write dissertations about someday. The kind of silence that happened when an entire room full of people realized that the universe had just shifted in a fundamental way that nobody had seen coming. According to the ancient laws, one of the Alpha Council members had said slowly, yes, the cubs have chosen. The choice must be honored. This is insane, another council member had protested. She's not even our species. She can't possibly understand what it means to be a pack leader, to guide young Thylorians, to risk everything to save their lives, Dahlia had interrupted. To put their well-being above politics and protocol and personal safety. Because I'm pretty sure I just demonstrated a pretty solid understanding of those concepts. Gorvak had looked like he was about to respond when his comm device had chirped with an incoming priority message. His expression had darkened as he listened to whatever urgent update he was receiving. What is it? One of the council members had asked. The other facilities, Gorvak had said grimly. Word has spread about what happened here. Medics across the planet are demanding access to the human medicine. Parents are threatening to storm the facilities if we don't provide treatment for their cubs. And... Dahlia had prompted. And 3 more facilities have reported the same bonding behavior. Cubs who've been treated with your medicine are refusing to return to their birth parents. They're all asking for the human pack mother. The cubs around Dahlia had seemed to sense the tension in the room, pressing closer to her with small whimpers of concern. She'd found herself automatically making soothing sounds, the kind of wordless comfort that transcended species boundaries. This is a catastrophe, one of the council members had said. If cubs across the planet start rejecting their birth parents in favor of an alien, then maybe, Dahlia had said quietly, you should ask yourselves why they're making that choice. These cubs were dying because your pride wouldn't let you accept help. They were suffering because your traditions were more important than their lives. Maybe they're bonding with me not because of some biological quirk, but because I was the one who showed up when they needed someone most. Torix had stepped forward, his voice carefully respectful but firm. The human speaks truth, honored counselors. Our healing methods failed. Our pride nearly cost us an entire generation. She risked everything to save children who weren't even her own species. The law is clear, Thaxus had said reluctantly. If the cubs have chosen her as pack leader, that choice must be respected. But, he'd added quickly, there are procedures, challenges, ways to test whether an individual is truly worthy of pack leadership. What kind of challenges? Dahlia had asked, though something in her tone suggested she already suspected she wasn't going to like the answer. Combat, typically, Gorvak had replied with what might have been the ghost of a smile. Single combat against any pack member who questions your worthiness. To the death, traditionally. The cubs had responded to this news with a collective growl that would have been adorable if it hadn't been so genuinely threatening. 34 small voices raised in harmony, making it very clear what they thought of anyone who wanted to challenge their chosen pack mother. However, one of the council members had said hastily, given the unique circumstances, perhaps we could consider alternative forms of challenge. Something more suited to evaluating leadership qualities rather than combat prowess. What did you have in mind? Dahlia had asked. A test of wisdom, of your ability to solve the problems facing our people. If you can prove that your leadership would benefit not just these cubs, but our entire species. Then what? Then, Gorvak had said, his expression unreadable. You would become the first non-Thylorian pack leader in our history, with all the rights, responsibilities, and consequences that entails. Dahlia had looked around at the cubs who'd chosen her, at their trusting faces and unwavering loyalty. She'd thought about the thousands of other cubs across the planet who were still sick, still dying, still waiting for someone to put their lives above politics and pride. "What's the challenge?" she'd asked. Because honestly, after breaking into an alien medical facility, violating approximately 16 different interstellar laws, and accidentally becoming the pack mother to 34 alien children, how much worse could things possibly get? The universe, as it turned out, was about to show her exactly how much worse things could get. The challenge of leadership, as it turned out, was not what Dahlia had expected. She'd been prepared for some kind of formal trial, maybe a debate in front of the Alpha Council, possibly even the threatened single combat with ceremonial weapons and dramatic speeches about honor. What she got instead was a room full of the most stubborn, prideful, politically entrenched individuals she'd ever encountered, all of whom seemed determined to prove that they'd rather watch their civilization crumble than admit they might have been wrong about something. "The challenge is simple," Gorvak had announced, gesturing to a holographic display that showed infection rates across the planet. "Solve the crisis. All of it. Not just the medical emergency, but the social, political, and cultural implications of what you've done. Prove that your interference was worth the chaos you've created." Dahlia had studied the data streaming across the display. Infection rates that were climbing exponentially. Medical facilities overwhelmed. Parents rioting in the streets, demanding access to human medicine while simultaneously protesting the cultural contamination of their children. Political factions forming around pro-human and anti-human positions. A society tearing itself apart over the question of whether accepting help from aliens was salvation or surrender. "You want me to fix all of this," she'd said slowly, "while a bunch of sick children are still dying because you're too proud to distribute medicine that you know works." "The medicine is not the issue," one of the council members had snapped. "The issue is what comes after. If we accept human medical intervention, where does it end? Do we become dependent on alien technology? Do we lose our identity as Thylorians?" Dahlia had looked around the room, at faces that were equal parts desperate and defiant, and suddenly understood what the real problem was. This wasn't about medicine or pride or even cultural contamination. This was about fear. "You know what I think?" she'd said, settling cross-legged on the floor while several cubs immediately arranged themselves around her like furry bodyguards. "I think you're all missing the point so spectacularly that it would be funny if children weren't dying while you debate." The temperature in the room had dropped noticeably. "The challenge isn't to choose between Thylorian medicine and human medicine," Dahlia had continued. "The challenge is to figure out why you think those are the only two options." She gestured to Torix, who'd been standing quietly by the wall. "Your own medics have been working without sleep for weeks, trying everything they could think of to save these cubs. They're not failures because human medicine worked where theirs didn't. They're heroes who fought an impossible battle with insufficient tools." "But our traditional methods," one of the elders had begun. "Your traditional methods," Dahlia had interrupted, "were developed to fight diseases that existed hundreds of years ago. This plague is new, evolved, adapted specifically to exploit vulnerabilities in Thylorian immune systems. Expecting ancient remedies to work against a modern threat isn't traditional wisdom. It's willful blindness." She'd stood up, gently relocating the cubs who'd been using her as furniture. "But here's the thing. My medicine didn't save these cubs. Your medics did. Torix did. They kept these children alive long enough for the cure to work. They monitored dosages, managed symptoms, provided the supportive care that made recovery possible." The room had gone quiet except for the soft sounds of cubs who were starting to get sleepy and didn't particularly care about political implications. "What if," Dahlia had said, "instead of arguing about whether to accept human help or reject it, you started thinking about how to combine the best of both approaches? What if you trained your medics in human techniques while we learned from your healing traditions? What if instead of cultural contamination, You saw this as an opportunity for cultural evolution. Impossible, Gorvak had said, but his tone lacked its earlier conviction. Our people would never accept such a radical change. Your people, Dahlia had replied, are literally rioting in the streets because they want their children to live. I think they're more ready for change than you realize. She'd walked to the holographic display, manipulating the controls with the kind of casual competence that came from years of dealing with alien technology. Look at these numbers. Really look at them. The facilities where cubs have been treated with human medicine? Infection rates have dropped to 0, not just among the treated children, but among their families, their communities. That's impossible, one of the council members had protested. The medicine was only given to cubs. Exactly. Dahlia had highlighted specific data points on the display. But the cubs who recovered, they're not just healthy, they're immune. And apparently that immunity is transferring to adults through close contact. Your own immune systems are learning to fight this plague by observing how the treated cubs' systems handle it. The silence that followed was the kind that happened when everyone in the room simultaneously realized they'd been thinking about the problem in entirely the wrong way. So you're saying, Torix had said slowly, that by treating the cubs, we've actually created a natural vaccination program for the entire population? I'm saying, Dahlia had replied, that sometimes the best solution isn't choosing between two options. Sometimes it's finding the third option that nobody thought to look for. Gorvak had stared at the data for a long moment, his expression cycling through disbelief, calculation, and what might have been the beginning of hope. If this immunity transfer continues, then within a generation, your entire species will be naturally immune to this plague, and probably several others, Dahlia had finished, all because someone was willing to try something different. And the cultural implications? Dahlia had shrugged. Your cubs chose me as pack leader not because I'm human, but because I showed up when they needed help. When they grow up, they're going to remember that lesson. They're going to be the generation that doesn't see cooperation as weakness or accepting help as failure. She gestured to the cubs arranged around the room, some dozing, others playing quiet games, all of them radiating the kind of contentment that came from being healthy and safe and loved. They're going to be the generation that saves the galaxy, she'd said simply. And honestly, I can't think of a better legacy than that. The vote, when it came, was unanimous. Not just to distribute the medicine, but to establish the first interspecies medical exchange program in galactic history, to create joint research facilities, to train the next generation of healers in techniques that drew from the best of multiple worlds. 6 months later, Dahlia had received a transmission from Earth. Not a court-martial summons, as she'd expected, but a promotion. Apparently, 14 other species had contacted humanity requesting medical assistance, all of them specifically asking for the Pack Mother of Thylor. The cubs, now fully recovered and growing fast, still called her their Pack Mother, but they called Torix and their birth parents that too, because apparently Thylorian family structures were flexible enough to accommodate multiple parental figures when everyone involved was committed to the well-being of the children. And sometimes, late at night when she was reading bedtime stories to a room full of furry, sleepy faces, Dahlia reflected on the fact that she'd set out to save a few dozen sick children and had accidentally started a revolution in interspecies cooperation. The universe, as it turned out, had quite a sense of humor, but then again, so did she.